What if the earliest Buddhist path was far less democratic than modern spirituality wants it to be? Not a weekend practice, not mindfulness for stress relief, but a complete training system built around renunciation, discipline, and liberation from samsara. This is the claim at the heart of Theravada Buddhism, the school of the elders. They say they preserve the Buddha's teaching as closely as any tradition can. The texts, the practices, the monastic structure. No additions, no innovations, no compromises. And after mapping Buddhism's major schools on this channel, it's time to examine them one by one, starting with Theravada, the oldest complete record we have. So today, what is Theravada? What did they preserve? And does oldest mean truest? Before we ask whether Theravada represents the earliest Buddhism, we need to understand what they actually claim, and it's more specific and more controversial than it sounds. After the Buddha's death, competing interpretations emerged. We covered this in How Buddhism Split into Three, the original divide between the elders, the Theras, and the Great Assembly, the Mahasanghikas. Theravada descends from that conservative elders' lineage. Their claim, unbroken transmission, Buddha to his direct disciples down through 2,500 years of teachers. When Theravada says we preserved the teaching, they mean something very specific. We preserved what our earliest sources record, what the Buddha spoke in a language close to the linguistic world in which he taught, maintained through oral tradition, then committed to writing. And crucially, they reject texts that later schools accept as the Buddha's words. That's a serious claim. The foundation? The Pali Canon, the Tipitaka, the Three Baskets. According to Theravada tradition, this was rooted in the earliest Buddhist communities, monks from the generation that knew the Buddha and the generation immediately after. Recited at the first Buddhist council, held sometime in the months following the Buddha's death. Written down centuries later in Sri Lanka during the 1st century BCE. Now, Mahayana Sutras, texts from other schools, appear 400 to 600 years later. From Theravada's perspective, these are later compositions. Valuable perhaps, but not the Buddha's original teaching. From Mahayana's perspective, these are deeper teachings revealed when audiences were ready to receive them. The debate isn't just about age, it's about authority. What does conservative mean here? Strict adherence to the monastic code, the Vinaya, suspicion of devotional practices not found in the early texts, resistance to innovation, adaptation, new interpretations. The goal, preserve, not evolve. Now this is Theravada's claim about themselves. Other Buddhist schools would say, you preserved one strand of the teaching, but you missed the deeper dimension. To which Theravada responds, prove it. Show me where the Buddha taught these deeper doctrines you're describing. And this argument has continued for 2,000 years. And this is where it gets serious. If Theravada represents the earliest documented Buddhism, then later schools, Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Pure Land, are based on texts that appeared centuries after the Buddha. From Theravada's perspective, those traditions are later developments. From their perspective, Theravada preserved the letter, but missed the spirit. Who's right? We can't settle that today. But we can understand what Theravada actually preserved. Starting with the texts themselves. Imagine you could read transcripts of Socrates' actual conversations, not Plato's interpretations 40 years later, not Aristotle's summaries, but records attributed to people who were there when he spoke. Theravada claims the Pali Canon represents that for Buddhism. The Pali Canon is massive, the largest collection of early Buddhist texts in any language, written in Pali, a Middle Indo-Aryan language close to what the Buddha likely spoke. 3 baskets, the Tipitaka. First, the Vinaya Pitaka, monastic discipline, rules for monks and nuns, stories of how those rules originated. Second, the Sutta Pitaka, discourses, the Buddha's teachings to various audiences, kings and beggars, monks and laypeople, philosophers and skeptics. This includes the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha's first sermon on the Four Noble Truths, and the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundational discourse on mindfulness practice. Third, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, systematic philosophy, an analytical framework for understanding mind and reality, though scholars debate whether the Buddha himself taught this or whether it was developed by later monks. For the first 400 years, nothing was written down. Monasteries at dawn, hundreds of monks chanting in unison, the same verses their teachers chanted, the same verses their teachers' teachers chanted, back through generations. One monk starts Ananda's discourse, others join, their voices overlapping, correcting any deviation. This wasn't casual memorization. This was institutional redundancy, a human backup system before writing existed. According to tradition, the first Buddhist council was essentially a massive recitation. Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant, recited all the discourses from memory. Upali recited all the monastic rules. 500 senior monks verified the accuracy. Multiple councils followed over the centuries, each one preserving and verifying the teachings. Then in the 1st century BCE crisis, Sri Lanka was hit by famine, monks were dying, and suddenly a terrifying realization: if the remaining elders die before the rains end, 4 centuries of preserved teaching dies with them. Everything the Buddha said, gone. So they made a radical decision. The Sangha convened an emergency council at Aluvihara. For the first time, the Buddha's words were committed to palm leaf manuscripts, preserved in Sinhala script, later standardized across Southeast Asia. Buddhism's oral tradition finally captured in writing. Scholars like Richard Gombrich and Bhikkhu Bodhi broadly agree on this much. The Pali Canon is the oldest complete Buddhist literature we have, and it preserves material that almost certainly reaches back to the early Buddhist communities. 400 years of oral transmission means changes were inevitable, but the system was structured to preserve meaning across generations. When modern scholars want to study what the Buddha likely taught, they start here. Not because it's perfect, but because it's the earliest comprehensive record available. Other schools' texts, Mahayana Sutras, Tibetan Tantras, appear much later, centuries later. Doesn't make them false, but makes them harder to attribute directly to the Buddha. The Theravada argument. We have texts attributed to disciples who knew the Buddha, preserved through rigorous oral tradition, written down within 5 centuries of his death. Mahayana Sutras appear centuries later, in a different language, claiming the Buddha taught them secretly to advanced students. Mahayana would respond, Theravada preserved the public teachings. We preserved the advanced ones. The Buddha taught on multiple levels. Fair point, but without documentary evidence earlier than the Pali Canon, it remains a matter of faith rather than historical reconstruction. And what does that earliest record teach? Here's where things get interesting. If you know one thing about Buddhism, it's probably the Four Noble Truths or meditation or karma. But Theravada doesn't just teach ideas, it teaches a complete training system designed to end suffering permanently. Not manage it, not cope with it, end it. Before we get into the philosophy and Theravada gets philosophical, let's be clear about the problem this system addresses. You right now are dissatisfied with something, maybe big, maybe small. That feeling is what Buddhism starts with, not as cosmic poetry, but as a diagnosis. The foundation of all Theravada teaching, the three marks of existence. First, dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but it's more subtle. Dukkha means unsatisfactoriness, stress, dis-ease. Even pleasant experiences are dukkha because they don't last. They lead to loss. They don't fully satisfy. They leave us wanting more. They're subject to change. They can turn into pain at any moment. You get the job you wanted, feel great for a week, maybe a month. Then it's normal. Then you're stressed about performance reviews. Even success becomes unsatisfying. This is the fundamental problem Theravada addresses. Second, anicca, impermanence. Everything changes, nothing is stable. Right now your body is aging, cells dying and regenerating. Your thoughts from 5 minutes ago? Gone. The emotion you felt this morning? Changed. Everything in motion. Clinging to what changes? Suffering. Seeing impermanence directly? Liberation. Third, anatta, non-self. The most radical teaching in Buddhism. There is no permanent, unchanging you. What we call self is a process, not a thing. The Buddha analyzed this process into 5 aggregates, the 5 khandhas, which we covered in depth in our video, The Buddha's 5 Aggregates Explained. Form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, none of these is you. They all arise and pass away. Wait, if there's no self, who suffers? What needs to be liberated? Buddhism doesn't deny experience. You're experiencing something right now that's not in question. What Buddhism denies is a permanent, independent essence behind experience. Close your eyes. Where is the you? In your thoughts? They come and go. Your body? Constantly changing. Your memories? They shift and fade. Suffering happens in conditioned processes. Sensations arise, feelings arise, thoughts arise, each moment dependent on causes. And within those processes, clinging happens. I want this. I don't want that. I am this. I am not that. Liberation is the ending of clinging within those processes, not the ending of experience itself, but the ending of the grasping that turns experience into suffering. No permanent self to liberate, just the process of clinging, which can stop. So here's the treatment. The 4 Noble Truths laid out in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha's first sermon. We have a dedicated video breaking these down, but briefly. First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering, dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, illness is dukkha, death is dukkha. Separation from what we love is dukkha. Contact with what we hate is dukkha. Not getting what we want, dukkha. Second Noble Truth, the truth of the cause, samudaya. Craving, tanha, drives the cycle. 3 types: craving for sensory pleasure, craving for existence, craving for non-existence. And underneath, ignorance, avidya, not seeing the 3 marks clearly. Third Noble Truth, the truth of cessation, nirodha. Suffering can end. Nibbana, nirvana, is possible. Fourth Noble Truth, the truth of the path, magga. The Eightfold Path is the method. The Eightfold Path breaks down into 3 training areas. Wisdom, panya, right view. Understanding the 4 Noble Truths, seeing reality as it is. Right intention, renunciation, goodwill, harmlessness. Notice, the path starts with right view. Not faith, not obedience, understanding. You can't walk the path without seeing where it leads and why it matters. This is why Theravada emphasizes study alongside practice. Ethics, Shila, right speech, right action, right livelihood. Before you can stabilize the mind, you need an ethical foundation. Right speech means not lying, but also not gossiping, not using harsh language, not empty chatter. Each precept has depth. The 5 precepts aren't commandments, they're training rules that reduce remorse, guilt, agitation. A mind free from ethical conflict concentrates naturally. Concentration, samadhi, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Deep meditative absorption, stabilizing the mind completely. These aren't separate practices, they work together. Ethics stabilizes your life. Concentration steadies your mind. Wisdom cuts through ignorance. All 3 supporting each other. And the goal? Nirvana, Nibbana. Not heaven, not eternal bliss, not merging with cosmic consciousness. The complete ending of greed, hatred, and delusion. Freedom from samsara, often described negatively because it's beyond conceptual understanding, achievable in this life. The path isn't binary. Theravada maps 4 stages of awakening: stream entry, once returner, non-returner, and finally arahant. The key point is that liberation is presented as gradual and verifiable. This differs from Mahayana in a crucial way. Theravada's goal: become an arahant, a fully enlightened being free from samsara. Mahayana's goal: become a bodhisattva, postpone final liberation to help all beings. From Theravada's perspective, liberation is the point, you don't postpone it. From Mahayana's perspective, compassion takes priority. Staying in samsara to help others is the higher path. We'll explore that tension in the next video on Mahayana. Theravada doesn't present Buddhism as comfort or inspiration. It presents it as training, a complete system for a specific condition. So liberation is the goal. The method is uncompromising. Train your mind until you see reality so clearly that craving can't arise. Which raises the obvious question: how do you actually train the mind to see reality that clearly? When most people hear Buddhist meditation, they think, sit quietly, watch your breath, feel calmer. Not wrong, but in Theravada, that's the beginning. Meditation isn't the goal, it's the tool you use to dismantle suffering at its root. Theravada uses 2 types of meditation. First, Samatha, calm, concentration. You train attention to become stable, unified, powerful. You focus on a single object, the breath, a visualization, a phrase. Develop jhanas, deep states of meditative absorption. Your mind becomes so concentrated that distractions fall away entirely. Your body feels light, almost electric. Waves of contentment arise without needing a reason. First jhana, joy and rapture born from seclusion. In the second jhana, mental chatter falls away completely. What remains is joy born from concentration itself. By the 3rd and 4th jhanas, even that joy settles into deep equanimity, balanced, steady, undisturbed. Beyond that, 4 more formless jhanas, states beyond material form entirely. The jhanas aren't the final goal, but they reshape the mind so insight becomes possible. They purify distractions, develop the concentration needed for insight, and create blissful states that reduce craving for sensual pleasures. When you've experienced joy born from concentration, the world's pleasures seem less compelling. This changes the economics of desire. Why chase fleeting sensory pleasure when you can generate profound contentment through training alone? Second type of meditation, Vipassana, insight, clear seeing. You investigate reality directly to see the three marks of existence, not thinking about impermanence, experiencing it, moment to moment, observing how sensations, thoughts, emotions arise and pass away, seeing that there's no solid self behind experience. The method is called Satipatthana, the four foundations of mindfulness, laid out in the Satipatthana Sutta, one of the most important texts in the Pali Canon. First foundation, mindfulness of body. You sit, you feel your posture, the pressure of your legs on the cushion, the rise and fall of breath in your belly. You're not thinking about your body, you're feeling it directly, sensation by sensation. A meditator on retreat notices an itch on her ankle. Normally, she'd scratch immediately, but she watches instead. The tingle sharpens, becomes almost unbearable, then fragments into separate pulses, then fades completely. She never moved. The itch dissolved on its own, and in that moment, she sees. Sensations arise and pass whether you react or not. The impulse to act isn't you. It's just another arising phenomenon. Second foundation, mindfulness of feelings. A pleasant sensation arises in your chest. You label it pleasant. It fades. An unpleasant tension appears in your shoulder. Unpleasant. It changes. Neither clinging nor pushing away, just watching. Third foundation, mindfulness of mind. Anger arises. You don't think, I'm angry. You observe. Anger is present. It passes. Calm follows. You see, mental states come and go like weather. A practitioner in deep Vipassana notices anger arising after a perceived slight. But before it can become my anger, before the storyline can start, he sees it fragment, heat in the chest, tightness in the jaw, racing thoughts, all separate processes. By the time he's finished noting them, the anger has dissolved. What remains? Just body sensations and mental events, no solid emotion to carry or justify. Fourth foundation, mindfulness of phenomena. You start seeing patterns directly. Everything that arises passes. Nothing is permanent. And there's no you having these experiences. Just experience happening, each moment arising from conditions. Gradually you see, everything arises and passes. Eventually you realize, there's no one having these experiences. Experience arising and passing, each moment dependent on conditions. When this is seen deeply enough, craving stops, suffering ends. In the 5th century, the scholar Buddhaghosa compiled the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, systematizing the entire Theravada training into a comprehensive manual. It maps the progression from initial concentration through the jhanas to the stages of insight and final awakening. Samatha and Vipassana work together. Samatha is like sharpening a knife. Vipassana is like using that knife to cut through delusion. Some teachers emphasize Samatha first. The Burmese traditions often do. Some emphasize Vipassana directly. Some Thai forest approaches. Both are part of the complete path, though different lineages emphasize different sequences. Modern mindfulness is different. It's usually aimed at stress reduction and focus, practiced in a secular context for 10 or 20 minutes a day. Traditional Vipassana aims at something much deeper, seeing impermanence, non-self, and suffering clearly enough to uproot craving, often through sustained practice over long periods of time. The Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on breath meditation, gives simple instructions. Breathing in long, notice that. Breathing in short, notice that. Direct. No mysticism. Just know what you're doing while you're doing it. But the text goes much further. It maps how breath awareness leads to insight into impermanence, dissolution, and letting go. Sustaining that quality of knowing, breath after breath, hour after hour, where the training begins. Using meditation for relaxation versus liberation, it's like using a scalpel to open packages instead of performing surgery. Same tool, profoundly different application. Modern people think, I meditate 10 minutes a day, I'm practicing Buddhism. From a classical Theravada perspective, beneficial, certainly better than not meditating at all, but not the path to liberation. To train the mind at this depth requires far more than occasional practice. It rests on ethics, sustained effort, and often unfolds in retreat or monastic conditions. Not 10 minutes on an app, not a weekend reset, years of disciplined practice, observing reality closely enough that craving begins to lose its footing. Historically, this was treated as a full-time job. Which brings us to the most controversial question in early Buddhism. Was enlightenment ever meant to be accessible to regular people? Let's be direct. Classical Theravada structured Buddhism around a two-tier system, monks and nuns as full-time practitioners training for enlightenment, lay people as supporters of the Sangha, practicing generosity and ethics, building merit for future rebirths. Sounds elitist to modern ears, but was it elitist or realistic? The ultimate achievement in Theravada is becoming an arahant, one who has uprooted all defilements. The classical view? Achieving this requires renunciation of household life, becoming a monk or nun, following 227 precepts if you're a monk or 311 if you're a nun, dedicating your life entirely to training. Why? Because the Buddha himself left his family to achieve enlightenment. The logic, if he needed to renounce everything, why would the path be easier for us? The monastic Sangha originally included both monks and nuns, bhikkhunas, though in many Theravada countries, full ordination for women died out, and restoration efforts today remain contentious. So what about lay people? The classical model for lay people was simpler: generosity, ethical living, and basic meditation, supporting the monastic community while building merit for future rebirth. Their goal: build punya, merit, for a better rebirth. Perhaps achieve stream entry, the first stage of awakening. Full liberation? Possible in theory, extremely rare in practice. More realistic: practice now, ordain in a future life, achieve liberation then. This wasn't arbitrary. It reflected a multi-life logic of karma and rebirth. We covered karma in our video, What is Karma in Buddhism? But the basic idea, lay support of the Sangha, made sense because most people weren't trying to optimize this life. They were situating themselves within a multi-life path. This created what's called the merit economy. Lay people give material support to monks. Monks give spiritual teachings to lay people. Both sides benefit. Monks can practice full-time, lay people gain merit. Not transactional, symbiotic. The nuance modern people miss. This wasn't lay people can't be enlightened. It was that enlightenment requires conditions most people don't have: time, freedom, sustained practice. Look at the early texts. Again and again, liberation is linked to going forth from the household life into homelessness. The Anattalakkhana Sutta, where the Buddha teaches the 5 aggregates and non-self to 5 ascetics, is addressed to renunciants. Mahayana pushed back on this. They accused Theravada of elitism, argued that the Buddha's compassion means the path must be accessible to everyone. So they developed the Bodhisattva ideal: postpone enlightenment to help others. They created Pure Land devotion, a faith-based path for lay people. From Theravada's perspective, you're making it easier but diluting the training. From Mahayana's perspective, you're gatekeeping enlightenment behind impossible requirements. The 20th century brought change. Burmese monks, Laity Sayadaw, Mahasi Sayadaw, started teaching Vipassana to lay people. Unprecedented. Intensive meditation training outside monasteries. S.N. Goenka brought 10-day courses to India, then worldwide. Today, many lay people practice intensively, retreats, daily meditation. Some achieve deep insights without ordaining. But most successful lay practitioners still take extended retreat time, weeks or months. Often reduce work and family commitments, create semi-monastic conditions. The requirements haven't disappeared, the formal robes have. So is Theravada elitist or honest? Anything difficult requires conditions. You can't reach elite athletic performance, complete a doctorate, or master an instrument without making real sacrifices. Theravada says enlightenment is no different. Modern Buddhism often calls that gatekeeping. Both have a point. When you're juggling work, relationships, and bills, how much time and energy is left for the kind of deep mental training liberation requires? For most people, not much. Classical Theravada answered, build merit, practice ethics, support those who train full-time, and maybe you'll have the conditions for liberation in a future life. Modern Theravada answers, we've adapted. Lay meditation is possible, but the core training requirements haven't changed. You still need time, guidance, sustained effort. Which answer is right depends on what you think Buddhism is for. So Theravada preserved a demanding, uncompromising path structured around renunciation and monastic training. You might expect that kind of rigidity to die out. Too hard, too narrow, too disconnected from how most people live. Instead, it became the foundation of an entire region's spiritual life. How? Buddhism disappeared from the land of its birth. By the 13th century, there were almost no Buddhists left in India. But Theravada, it became the state religion of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. Over 150 million people practice it today. Short answer: kings, and a very rigid system. In the 3rd century BCE, Theravada reached Sri Lanka. Island geography protected it. The invasions that devastated mainland Buddhism couldn't easily reach Sri Lanka. Between the 1st and 11th centuries CE, Theravada spread to Southeast Asia via trade routes, adopted as the state religion by kings who built monasteries and supported monks. The strange part is this: Theravada survived because it was conservative. We covered why Buddhism vanished from India in a dedicated video. The forces that killed it there saved it in Southeast Asia. In India, where Buddhism faced rapid political and religious shifts, rigidity made it vulnerable. It couldn't bend, so it broke. In Southeast Asia, where kings provided stable institutional support across centuries, that same rigidity made it resilient. It became a time capsule. When scholars want to understand what the Buddha likely taught, they start with Theravada, the oldest complete record available, preserved through unchanging monastic transmission. But the story doesn't end in ancient monasteries. Because in the modern world, Theravada monks did something unprecedented. They brought intensive meditation to lay people. If you've ever taken a meditation class, gone on a retreat, or used a mindfulness app, there's a good chance you're practicing a technique that came from Theravada. Not ancient Theravada, modern Theravada. Because in the 20th century, something unprecedented happened. Here's the surprising part. The tradition most associated with monastic rigor and scriptural conservatism became the source of lay meditation culture across the world. 3 waves reshaped Theravada. First wave, the Burmese revival. In early 1900s, Burma, a monk named Laity Sayadaw revived Vipassana meditation. He argued lay people can practice intensive meditation, and he trained thousands of students. Then Mahasi Sayadaw, building on that foundation, systematized the practice, rising, falling, sitting, touching, labeling every sensation, noting every movement. He made Vipassana teachable, scalable, establishing meditation centers across Burma that trained practitioners by the thousands. One of those students was S.N. Goenka, an Indian businessman trained in Burma. In 1969, he brought 10-day Vipassana courses back to India, then worldwide, USA, Europe, Australia. Goenka taught what he called secular Vipassana, focused on technique rather than religious identity. This is not Buddhism, he'd say. This is Dhamma, universal law. Goenka's courses require complete silence for 10 days straight. Tens of thousands have done it. Second wave, Western adaptation. In the 1960s and 70s, Western seekers traveled to Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka. They studied under Thai and Burmese masters. Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and Sharon Salzberg helped build institutions like Insight Meditation Society and Spirit Rock, adapting Theravada meditation for Western audiences. The Thai forest tradition took a different path. Ajahn Chah, a Thai monk, emphasized simplicity, meditation in nature. He trained Western monks, Ajahn Sumedho, Ajahn Brahm, who established monasteries in England, Australia, the United States, preserving traditional monastic rigor while making the teachings accessible. What emerged was not a single movement, but an entire lay meditation culture built from Theravada techniques and then reshaped for modern life. Third wave, secular mainstreaming. In 1979, John Kabat-Zinn created MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. He stripped meditation of its religious context, applied it to hospitals, prisons, schools, corporations. Now there are apps, Headspace, Calm, Insight Timer. Millions of people meditate daily who've never heard of Theravada. And here's where opinions divide. Is this still Buddhism? Defenders say making meditation accessible reduces suffering. That's what the Buddha wanted. Critics say removing ethics and the goal of liberation turns meditation into another wellness product, self-help rather than spiritual practice. Both are happening, and Theravada monastics are divided on whether to celebrate or mourn it. Brief note: Theravada isn't frozen in amber. In Myanmar, monks led the 2007 Saffron Revolution. Thousands marched against the military junta. Some were shot. In Sri Lanka and Myanmar today, some monks support Buddhist nationalism, sometimes clashing with Muslim communities. The tradition is grappling with modern politics for better and worse. So where did Theravada end up in the 21st century? The school that structured its path around full-time monastic training now teaches meditation to anyone with a weekend free. The tradition that preserved the most rigorous path has become the source of secular mindfulness for stress relief. Is that evolution or dilution? From one perspective, Theravada is finally making the Buddha's teaching accessible to everyone. Progress. From another, stripping meditation from its ethical and philosophical context turns it into another wellness technique. A loss. Both are happening. Which one you see depends on what you think Buddhism is for. So after 2,500 years, dozens of countries, millions of practitioners, centuries of debate, what is Theravada? We started with a question. Is Theravada the Buddhism the Buddha actually taught? After everything we've covered, the honest answer, we can't know for certain. But we can know something more useful. Theravada preserved the oldest Buddhist literature, the Pali Canon. It maintains the closest documented connection to early Buddhism. Its conservative approach kept doctrine and practice relatively intact. And scholars broadly agree, if you want to study what early Buddhism likely looked like, you start with Theravada. What we don't know, was oral transmission accurate across 400 years? Did early monastics filter teachings through their own biases? Would the Buddha recognize modern Theravada as his teaching? And most important, is original even the right question? Mahayana doesn't dispute Theravada's age. They dispute its completeness, their claim. The Buddha taught different audiences different things. Advanced teachings, Mahayana sutras, weren't invented. They were revealed when students were ready. From Theravada's perspective, convenient claim, show me the evidence. From Mahayana's perspective, you're confusing earliest recorded with only true. This debate is unresolvable, and maybe that's okay. What Theravada offers is rigor, a clear path, disciplined training, textual grounding, and a realistic assessment of how hard liberation really is. What it does not naturally offer is ease. Its classical form is renunciant, conservative, and far less devotional than many Mahayana traditions. You don't have to choose one school forever. Many Western practitioners blend traditions, but understanding the differences helps you practice intelligently. So is Theravada the path the Buddha actually taught? It's the closest documented connection we have, the earliest complete record, the oldest living tradition. But more important than original, Theravada preserved a vision of the Buddhist path that is uncompromising, demanding, difficult to water down. In a world where every spiritual teaching gets turned into a self-help product, that matters. Not because Theravada is perfect, but because it reminds us, without rigor, discipline, and transformation, Buddhism risks shrinking into something pleasant, comforting, and far smaller than the path it originally claimed to be. Whether you practice Theravada or not, that's worth remembering. The point is not to become more comfortable inside samsara. The point is to leave it. Next video, Mahayana. The school that said Theravada missed the point. They claim the Buddha taught something bigger, bolder, more compassionate, a path where personal liberation isn't enough. You need to save all beings. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And leave a comment. Do you think Theravada preserved the Buddha's teaching, or just one interpretation of it? Check out our video, How Buddhism Split into Three, if you want to understand where this whole debate began. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay wise.